Hi, I'm Wendy. If you're here to learn about the extra stuff that you get tasked with at work, then you're in the right place. You're here to learn about invisible labor. But before we get started, I wanted to share with you a little bit about me. During the day, I'm the director of MBA programs at Forte. But before that, I spent about 10 years in the corporate sector. I had various brand management roles with Kraft Heinz, Burt's Bees, and Hanes brands. And yes, that's Mr. T. I've also worked in higher ed and the nonprofit space for 15 years at organizations including MLT, UNC Chapel Hill, and Purdue University. And yes, that is Purdue Pete. But through these experiences, I've developed a pretty solid foundation in workplace dynamics. So I'm here today to talk to you about invisible labor. It's a topic that's incredibly important, but it's often overlooked or ignored. Let me give you an example. Office celebrations. So think about the last office celebration you attended. I work from home now, but when I worked in the office, we celebrated everything. And the centerpiece of these celebrations, it was always cake. At my last job, I distinctly remember this. We would always have cake from this place called Mima's Sweet Shop. So everybody loved Mima's. And when the cake was brought out during a celebration, there was this moment of excitement around the cake. But there was always this unspoken question: who's gonna find a knife and who's gonna cut the cake? Did you ever notice that when there's cake, the same person always jumps up to cut it? And it's the same person every time. And more often than not, it's usually a woman. Is cake cutting reserved for women? Because we handle it without a second thought. And that right there is what I want to talk about today. Listen, let me start right away by giving you advice the next time you have a celebration with cake. Don't cut the cake. I don't care what level you are. You could be the CEO of the company. Don't cut the cake. Cutting the cake doesn't come with a title, doesn't come with a trophy, and it doesn't come with recognition, but someone always does it. It's either because they really like cutting cake or because no one else stepped up to do it. Cutting the cake is considered a form of invisible labor. Now, this term was coined by Arlene Kaplan Daniels in 1987. Invisible labor is the work that goes unpaid, unrecognized, unacknowledged. It's that extra work that someone has to do, but it's usually not in your job description. And unfortunately, invisible labor falls to women most of the time. So let me share how we can fix this. But first, let me go over the 3 things I want you to walk away with. The first thing is I want you to be able to recognize invisible labor and how it shows up in the workplace. You also really need to get a firm understanding of how it affects you and also your teammates. And then after this presentation, I want you to be able to walk away with techniques that will enable you to manage the labor you might encounter. Okay? Now, first question for the audience, and you can type in the chat what you think. What percentage of the workforce in the United States is made up of women? Take a moment, type it in the chat. Let me know what you think. Now, if you said 40%, you're incorrect. And if you said 50%, you're also incorrect. Women are almost 60% of the civilian labor force in the United States. We command a huge portion of the workforce. Huge. What do you think about when women's work comes to mind, though? What kind of positions do you think we're working in? Take a minute to think about that. What do you think of when you hear the term women's work? Now, usually when I ask people this question, the things that come up are, oh, teacher, nurse, cashier, hairdresser, designer. The common theme around these roles are that they are service oriented and they're hands on or nurturing roles. But what if I asked you what comes to mind when you hear the term men's work? What type of positions do you envision men working in? You can share in the chat if you want to. I would love to see what everyone thinks. But when I ask people this question, they usually come up with construction worker, doctor, lawyer, fireman, bartender, finance guy, president. Now, here's an interesting one, Kool-Aid Man. The Kool-Aid Man is an icon that seems to take charge. He looks very strong and he leads kids to a refreshing beverage. And he's a man. The common denominator around all of these roles are that they are strength oriented or leadership oriented. And I mean, are we saying that kids won't follow a Kool-Aid woman? Well, that's for another discussion. But what this really points to is the gendered division of labor. Now, men's work and women's work, both terms might bring to mind these old-fashioned gender expectations that have just been carried along from centuries to centuries. For women, we've always been looked at to handle domestic duties at home. And we're most suited for the nurturing roles in the workplace, like a nurse or a teacher. And we tend to be assigned stereotypical low-level organizational tasks, like administrative work. And when we were growing up, we were socialized to be friendly, good team players, and less confrontational. Now, for men, historically and throughout centuries, men were expected to work outside the home, provide for the family, and this was usually informal employment. They were thought of to be most suited for physical labor, skilled work, or a leadership position. And they were always assigned something that had to do with strategy or decision making. That's usually the tasks that they're responsible for. And when they were growing up, they were socialized to suppress their emotions. Never let them see you cry. These labels, they're problematic, but they're still found in workplaces today. Most importantly, and unfortunately, they contribute to the invisible labor that women typically find themselves in. This gender division of labor still exists in the workplace today. And I know I keep bringing this up, but ladies, don't cut the cake. Let "don't cut the cake" serve as a metaphor for how to approach invisible labor when it comes up in the workplace. But let's think about it for a minute. Why are we even asked to do these random tasks? And why are we always looked at as the automatic office helper, the automatic office cleaner-upper, or the automatic office caretaker? Well, to understand how we got here, let's take a quick look at the history of women entering the workforce in the United States. So, happy International Women's Day. Here's a little treat for you, a real quick history of women in the workforce. Let's start with 1800 so we can determine how we got here. In the early 1800s, women worked at home. We did all of the chores at home. We did cleaning and cooking, and we took care of the kids. And these roles were mostly centered around domestic tasks. We didn't do anything outside of the home. But in the late 1800s, in the early 1900s, we saw the Industrial Revolution, and this dramatically changed where women worked. A lot of women were working in factories, but they were also teachers, they were nurses, and they were maids. Overall, society just really wanted us to stay at home. But that didn't last for long because World War II The men went off to fight, and we needed someone to fill their position, so women stepped up. And millions of women worked in so many different roles. They took on machinist jobs, they were riveters, they were nurses, and they were even pilots while men were fighting abroad. But after World War II in the 1950s, guess what? The men wanted their jobs back. And so women were told to go back home. But if they weren't in the home and they held jobs outside, they were usually the type of jobs that were deemed appropriate for their gender. And these were things like clerical work, secretaries, and they were still in jobs like nursing and teaching. But we saw a little bit of improvement in the 1960s. We saw legal and social changes such as the Equal Pay Act and the Civil Rights Act. And more women were starting to go to college, and more women started entering into roles like law and medicine and business. But we still were considered subordinate to our male counterparts. Well, I think overall during that time, women were pissed that they could only take on jobs as secretaries and that the money they earned wasn't that much. So in response, the feminine movement emerged. And during the 1960s and the 1970s, these key issues like reproductive rights, workplace equality, and the fight against gender discrimination arose. And then by the end of the 1970s, women made up roughly 40% of the workforce. Now we're going to fast forward to the 1980s, and because more women were entering college, there was more women entering the workforce as well, and they were doing more specialized work, and they were starting to hold more leadership roles. But for any of you Gen Xers out there, think about it. Women, probably our mothers, were criticized for not being stay-at-home moms, and childcare options were limited and they were really expensive, but somehow women figured it out. And this is exactly why after-school programs, latchkey kids, and probably the popularity of the McDonald's Happy Meal came out in the 1980s. But then the 90s and the early 2000s, 50% of the workforce was made up of women. And on average, get this figure, married women in the 90s brought home 41% of the family's income. That's almost half of the family's income. By 1993, the enactment of the Family and Medical Leave Act was passed. And then by the new millennium, we saw more women in STEM positions like biology, health sciences, and engineering. Now today, we are so fortunate. We are so fortunate for the past 100 years that led us to having remote work. We now have paid parental leave. And again, we hold 60% of the civilian workforce. But what stands out to me is only a quarter of C-suite positions are held by women. And women still have limited opportunities to advance into top executive positions. Let's think about why. Did you ever consider invisible labor as a contributor to the glass ceiling for women in today's workplace? Now, women are still subjected to performance bias. And what exactly is performance bias? It's the unfair belief that men are naturally stronger, naturally smarter, and more competent and better leaders than women. That's performance bias. And historically, this has been held against us for a very long time. And some of you might see that today, which means women are more likely to be asked to do things in the office, such as organize staff celebrations, bring in coffee for the team, clean out that break room refrigerator, take notes in a meeting, console team members, set up for a meeting, recycle things. We do so many tasks around the office because no one else does it. And remember, invisible labor are the behind the scenes type of work that goes unpaid, unregulated, and sometimes unacknowledged. So I want you to think for a minute. What types of invisible labor type tasks have you been asked to do at work? We do these things because we get asked 44% more than men to do invisible labor at work. 44 more requests. And when we're asked to do these things, we say yes 76% of the time. A woman will step up and say, absolutely, I'll do it. On the other hand, men, half the time, they say no. For this exact reason, ladies, don't cut the cake. I know this is repetitive, but I just want it to stick with you by the time you leave today. Now, invisible labor, it has to show up all the time at work. To categorize what invisible labor may show up, I put it into 3 different sections. So the first one is domestic work. Let me give you an example. One of my previous roles, I had a coworker and she would take time to clean out the break room refrigerator at the end of every week. She even sent an email out to the team letting everybody know that things would be thrown away at the end of the week. She didn't have to do this, but she felt that if she didn't do it, the refrigerator would get nasty, it would get dirty, and no one else really cared about it. Because if she didn't do it, she thought, who would? Now, there's also administrative work. This is the stuff that probably bothers us, probably more than domestic work. It's keeping things in order and it's taking notes at a meeting. It could be answering random questions about HR things that coworkers may ask you. Years and years ago, here's an example. When I had a new role, this was fairly early in my career. I was new to the team and I had been in my role for about a month. One day I was asked by my manager to pick up lunch for the CEO and the entire executive team. I was not an executive assistant. Let me just put that out there. But this was asked of me before Uber Eats and Instacart existed. So I ended up having to use my own money, but I was reassured that I would get my money back. Well, it took up a lot of time from my work. And not only that, it created a mountain of anxiety around the timeliness of getting my money back. That is what bothered me the most. Now, there's also one more type of invisible labor, and that's emotional work. This work is the most stressful. It's the most hard. Think about if you may have ever fallen into this category. It's the person who keeps team morale high at work. It's the office cheerleader. It's the person who always has that positive outlook for anything that comes up. And it's also the individual who handles drama and conflict. This is the peacemaker, that one person that can step in and make things better. Emotional work, it's not in your job description. It can drain you. As you think about your career journey to date, do any of these scenarios sound familiar to you? Well, emotional work, it is the hardest category, but all invisible labor is harmful. Invisible labor does not help you develop new job skills, and it probably doesn't lead to a promotion or a bonus. But here's what it can lead to: mental health issues. Invisible labor, it can be so burdensome. It can lead to burnout, stress, anxiety, and it's probably because it's so hard for us to say no because we just feel guilty. And then that just adds more to the emotional strain. And then if you're asked to do these things all the time, it makes you question, do others see what your true worth is? Invisible labor can also prevent job progression. Because it goes unnoticed, it could potentially hold your career back. Here's why. If you're the person who always gets stuck doing the extra admin work or always being the person looked at to be the office cheerleader, it's going to become a time suck. And you'll notice you have less time to do the real work. You have less time to do the projects that actually count. And if you are always looked at to do these tasks, it's going to trap you, and it will make it harder for you to take on new opportunities and get ahead. And you know what this does? It contributes to the gender pay gap, because invisible labor not going to show up in your performance review and won't get you a bonus. The work that is more visible, we know that this is the work that gets rewarded. Now, be careful of taking on too many invisible tasks. Let's face it, somebody has to do it. It's going to get done, but I want you to be aware. Men are more likely to jump at those visible tasks that are directly tied to pay increases and bonuses. Now, if we're busy doing all of these other little projects that don't count, we will never have a chance to get ahead. Which brings me back again to don't cut the cake. Heed the warning. Again, I'm intentionally being repetitive. Don't cut the cake as your metaphor. It's to deter you from being the automatic designated volunteer. You're probably thinking, if I don't do it, then who's going to? Because nobody else will. Well, there's ways to manage and mitigate the invisible labor so you don't feel guilty and overwhelmed, okay? Now, as a team member, let me take you through 3 ways that you can do this. Imagine yourself sitting in a meeting in a conference room with about 20 people. And before the meeting begins, the organizer asks, can someone take notes during our meeting? As a team member or an individual contributor, when someone asks this in a meeting, the next time I want you to pause. Pause before you volunteer. Take a second to look around the room and think to yourself, are you the only person in this room who can do it? It's really easy to jump in when you feel there's a need, but before you raise your hand, think, could someone else handle this? Because if the answer is yes, just wait and see if someone else will volunteer. By doing this, you are creating space for others to step up. Next thing I want you to think about is this task a part of my role? Is it in my pay grade? Because there might actually be someone in the room whose responsibilities include administrative support. Don't think of this as avoiding responsibility. It's really about knowing your limits and recognizing that others are there for this very reason. They're there to do this exact job. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, don't feel guilty about saying no. It's so tough for us to say no. I know it is, because we don't want to let our colleagues down, but saying yes all the time will only lead to burnout and frustration. It's completely okay to say no. You're setting boundaries, you're protecting your mental and emotional well-being by doing this. And if someone asks you to take on something that's outside your capacity or your job expertise, it's fine to politely say this: I'm not able to take that on right now. I'm not able to take that on right now. It's so easy and so simple. Say that the next time. And also, you don't owe an explanation. Leader of an organization, you have the responsibility to both recognize and help mitigate invisible labor, because it can weigh heavily on your teams. Now, thinking about the example that I used on the prior slide, imagine you're leading a meeting and you need a volunteer to take notes. First thing you think about, instead of asking someone to volunteer, delegate the task. If you notice that one person always raises their hand to volunteer, pick someone else. It's very easy. Get to know your team's strengths and keep an eye on everyone's workload so that you make sure that no one is stuck carrying the entire load. Another great thing to consider is work on creating a supportive work culture. And you can do this by recognizing the unofficial work. Give a shout out to the team member who's always the one who steps up and volunteers. Publicly acknowledge them and offer small rewards. What this does is show the entire organization that all contributions matter, not just the big, obvious ones. This will build team spirit, it's going to cut down on resentment, and it makes sure the invisible labor is recognized. And I have one last idea for leaders. Have a quiet day. What's a quiet day? Okay, this is the coolest thing. Pick one day a week, pick a day out of the month where there's no meetings, there's no check-ins, no distractions are allowed. This gives your team time to catch up on all of those volunteered or voluntold tasks that tend to pile up for them. And it's a way to give your team space to knock out all of those tasks without the usual interruptions. And it will help reduce the burden of invisible labor. So, what is the overarching message that we leave here today? Don't cut the cake. Hopefully, all of you are saying it out loud. Don't cut the cake. I want you to remember this. And since everyone deserves a slice of the action, remember men can cut cake too. Thank you. And remember, don't cut the cake.